do now is I'll hand over to Penny and Ruth. But before I do that, I want to say a massive thank you to Penny and Ruth for agreeing to do this webinar. They've been very kind to do webinars and presentations for us before, but it is a great honour to have you both here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentations. Rather than go through a large amount of bio, I just thought I'd let you just introduce yourselves, if that's okay. And what we'll do, so the idea is Penny and Ruth will talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So please put your questions in the questions tab, and then I'll sort of host the question session. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to this webinar, our 40/40 vision. Looking back, what can we learn that's going to help us with the next 40 years? I'm not going to do extensive reading out a bio, but you'll gather who Penny is if you don't know her already. Both Penny and I are on the board of something called Talking Infrastructure, which we will also mention. But what I want to say, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to look very briefly at the start of asset management, which happens to be 40 years this April, which is fantastic, isn't it? And then looking back over those 40 years, what can we see in how asset management has developed? We're going to use something called the waves. Then we are going to take that and then think, what's the next wave? What's coming next? Wave 3. And that is a very important stage, a very important thing for asset managers to really grasp hold of in the near future. But there is something else that's happening in the world that we need to start thinking about now. So this webinar will end with, well, it'll end with a Q&A, but we've got some key takeaways from our experience, but then a call to action now, that is starting in 2024, because before it's too late. So that's what we're going to look at. Just to say, we're on the board of Talking Infrastructure, which is a non-profit, which is really looking at issues about how to make decisions about infrastructure for our communities, for future-friendly assets. And Talking Infrastructure is going to party like it's 2024 all year with a whole range of activities, articles, blogs, etc. Always with the learning from the last 40 years to think where we want to go in the next 40 years. We're not going to say too much about the history of asset management here, because we really want to talk about where does this take us next. But Penny, Talking Infrastructure, recently published Penny's book on the first decade of asset management, the story of asset management, with the subtitle, Infrastructure, We Can Afford to Build It, Can We Afford to Keep It? So, Penny, tell us, how did we get here?
Well, I don't know how many of you can remember when you first started to get interested in asset management, but I can remember to the actual day, not only to the day, to actually the hour. It was April the 12th, 1984, and about 11:30 in the morning. My group of corporate planning colleagues was listening to the ABC. It was a recording from Parliament, and our Minister for Water was talking very earnestly, and he was saying, in very serious tones, of course, as befitted his message, that from now on, we were going to charge the irrigators what it cost us to supply them with water. My instinctive response was to say, he can't do that. And the others laughed at me, and I said, of course he can do it. He can do anything he likes. He's the minister. I said, I didn't say he wasn't allowed to do it. I said, he can't do it. He doesn't have the information, and we don't have it to give him. We don't have our capital costs. Over lunch, I realised that this was not only true for irrigation water, it was true for all the services we provided. So that afternoon, I went to my branch manager and I said to him, how would you like to know how much it's really costing to supply South Australia with water and sewer services. Now, the whole thing could have stopped just there. He could have said, no thanks, and that would have been it. Fortunately, he didn't. His eyes lit up and he says, yes, I'd like to know that. So that's basically how it started. And we calculated the cost, well, the capital cost. When I say we calculated the capital cost, that sounds a very simple thing. It took about 10 months to do it. And it created a fair amount of excitement. But not at all as much as excitement as the second question that I asked. The next question was, hey, you know, we haven't done very much renewal lately because most of our assets are still pretty good, but they are aging. And so we have to expect that in the future we will be up for more in terms of renewal cost. The trouble is we don't know when and we don't know how much. So that was the next question. And once we started looking at that, then attitudes started to change. Because in order to get this information out, I just started with an ordinary piece of a tool that everybody knew. I mean, you all know it, everybody uses it. It's a life cycle model used for calculating net present value. But I wasn't interested in the discount factor. All I was interested in was the stream or distribution of asset costs over time. And to do that, when you consider that all of our assets were of different ages, some of them were 110 years old, others were rather younger, but we had to work out whereabouts in their life cycle each of these assets was. This meant a whole heap of calculations, masses and masses of calculations, but also lots of discussion with the engineers. And as a result of this, the engineers started to look at the world rather differently. Instead of just focusing on whatever was going wrong with the asset right in front of them, so the immediate problems, which is what they had been looking at, now they started to look further afield. Well, not exactly 40 years ahead yet, but nevertheless, they were starting to look much further forward. This was a great breakthrough. And as I look back now, I'm rather surprised by how quickly everything changed. The original prototype that we developed in the water industry took about 10 months, from April 1984 to February 1985. Then I moved into parliamentary committee, and then it took about two and a bit years to extend that prototype to all the major infrastructure in the state. Not all of it, but 80% of it. We dealt with the 7 largest infrastructure agencies. That's how quickly things can happen if you have the backing of a government body and their powers of a royal commission. I considered, as a researcher, I consider myself extremely fortunate. And you know, like 6 years ago, Jeff Rauder, one of our directors, and I were looking at what happened over time. We were sitting out in his back garden of his beautiful property up in the Blue Mountains, thoroughly enjoying ourselves and saying, hey, what did happen? And we realised that the path that we went through is the path that everybody goes through. It's a common asset management journey. And it consists of 3 stages. The first stage, or wave 1 as we call it, was called asset inventory. We all started the same way, figuring out what we had, what assets we had, where they were, what condition they were in, that kind of thing. At the beginning, it was necessary to design asset hierarchies and agree many terms, and that took forever. But now those issues have been dealt with and registered and recorded and now being taught, wave 1 can be much quicker. Wave 2 could begin when the organisations had enough information to be able to see the big picture of their portfolio. I should say when we somebody could see more than the asset that they were responsible for, and that includes the CEO. If the CEO can't step back and see the entire picture portfolio in front of him, he can't make any decisions on where priorities need to lie. And that was the situation we were in. But after information, we were in a better position. So with wave 2, we're able to move to making strategic decisions based on knowledge of what the information was across the board. And knowing how much funds we had, which was always the important thing, of course. Now, it's important to note that even though we have come a long way in understanding what assets we've got and the information on the basis of the asset industry, strategic asset management, the strange thing is that even though we know all this, new capital decisions do not take into account any of the information that we have learned in asset management. And that is frustrating to me, absolutely frustrating. Because what's the point in knowing all this information if we can't use it to make better decisions in future? And so this is when we started looking at wave 3. At the present moment, I would say that most of us are somewhere in wave 2. We might be just at the beginning of wave 2, in the middle, towards the end of wave 2. But really, I guess I'm talking to those of you who are more than halfway through wave 2, getting towards the end and ready to move into wave 3. So what is wave 3? Well, wave 3 is where we take the information that we've learned and we take the courage in our hands to advise our boards and our decision makers what they need to know in order to make wise, sound decisions for the future. At the present moment, this is not happening. Well, it's happening in some small circumstances. We have a few wave 3 practitioners. We need many, many more. It's only recently that I've started to see references to our asset management information in government reports. Recently, it was said that 20%, even though our initial capital costs are high, and everybody knows that, nevertheless, it's something like that 20% or even less of the total cost of the asset over its entire life cycle. That means that when we commit 20%, we've committed 80% to come up later. And that is not being taken into account by any of our decision makers, which is why we need to start doing the talking now. Even today, there's a lot of confusion between the costs of maintaining infrastructure in good repair and the provision of new capital. As many people think, if you just spend money on capital, all that really counts is how many dollars you spend. That's not so. If you use that money to repair your existing infrastructure, you've solved a problem. If you use that money to buy new assets, and we have the same old maintenance funding to be able to supply our existing portfolio, plus all of these new assets, we're going to end up with even greater degradation than we have now. So buying new assets can make things worse. And that is a message we really do need to get through. I'm not talking to the ignorant here. You all know this. It's just a matter of getting the message out to those who make the decisions. Okay then. So wave 3 is infrastructure decision making. This is where we use the asset management knowledge that we've gained to advise our boards and our decision makers on future acquisitions, so that these new acquisitions can be made fit for the future. At the moment, as I say, most asset managers are probably still in wave 2. Talking infrastructure was set up so we could help you move from wave 2 into wave 3, where you become advisors Now, this is probably what most of you want. It actually gives you a position on the board if you're good at it. So up until now, when we've considered the costs of new capital, we've only thought about financial costs. And one of the changes we're going to be making in wave 3 is we have to start thinking of not only economic costs, but the social and the environmental costs. And we also need to consider demand. Economists, like myself, we naturally think in demand. We have two crosses on our thing, demand and supply, and we know that we can operate on both of those. It had been traditional for engineers to focus only on the supply end. And so if we have an increase in demand, we increase the supply. We could equally work to reduce the demand. Economists know that. They're the kind of things that we have to consider. Okay, so as I said earlier, we have to consider what is needed. Our job is not just mindlessly to supply, and that's what we've been doing, but to consider the demand for new. In other words, we need to determine what is necessary infrastructure. This is the area which requires much development in wave 3. We're now well served with manuals for guidelines, high-level training, and even experienced practitioners to help us in waves 1 and wave 2. So we now have a scope for moving ahead. And bearing this in mind, Talking Infrastructure was created to help move the wave 2 practitioners into wave 3. Now, Ruth, I think you'd like to say something on this.
Yes, actually, I have to say at this point that I saw this morning in the paper, there's a report by the UK Government Audit Office, which is, if people haven't seen it, is fantastic on both these points, that we are spending recklessly without enough control on glamorous new assets that we should have much more, we should be asking much harder questions of. And we're wasting, this is a really great point, that we're wasting a lot of money by failing to maintain the existing infrastructure. So it just couldn't be more timely. So we've been working, I mean, I've been working with UK Treasury, IPA, and things like the UK Nuclear Decommissioning Authority on really much harder questions before we throw money capital at new, shiny new things. It's not a new theme, as Penny says, but we haven't seen enough of a movement of the dial to, there's a little bit of awareness that we have shocking backlogs in infrastructure because we fund capital and we don't fund maintenance and renewals. I want to just give here a couple of examples before talking about where does this all fit with a kind of larger picture of around the environment, for example. The one instance, Jeff Rudder from Talking Infrastructure, he and his team in the Blue Mountains City Council are really looking at issues of how infrastructure impacts on biodiversity as well as the environment. For example, runoff from concrete roads continues to destroy ecologies, the fragile ecologies of Blue Mountain World Heritage Site. And it isn't just about building them, it's actually that they continue to destroy things like ancient swamps. Another Talking Infrastructure colleague, Lou Cripps at RTD and his team, really trying to step up the board's questioning, getting them asking harder questions about things like new rail lines or expanding electric bus fleets, so that they ask better questions. So there's still a lot to be said there. But we're not going to, there's lots to be said, and I'm hoping all of you, we can keep this all going. But we wanted also to mention, there's obviously lots of thought about how we've got to be more sustainable, and the concept, for example, of the circular economy. Now, the thinking behind the circular economy I'm absolutely with, but it's mostly about the product cycle, which is that not only what materials we use to make the products, but making sure at the end of their useful life, they can in fact be then used as an input to another product. So there's a cycle. But infrastructure is a bit more, I mean, so the circular economy, essential for any asset manager working in manufacturing as a concept. But infrastructure is a little bit different than products. First of all, we can't do without infrastructure. So it's not a matter of, we must have infrastructure to sustain our societies, but all infrastructure impacts on the environment. And for me, and for talking infrastructure, it's how to think, it's almost like it's more about thinking about infrastructure within ecology of society in environment. It's not a simple circle, it's a complex ecology. And I guess the message around this is that we need to be working with other people thinking about sustainability and be thinking about, go back to what Penny said, what infrastructure do we really need and what are the best ways to actually supply it? And you can't do the second without asking the first. So this obviously fits with other thinking. I mean, actually, we're just talking about things like permaculture or the environmental economics that's going on. But we have to see infrastructure as being a key but powerful part of a complex system that we understand and understand where we cannot afford to see infrastructure in isolation or to ignore it. Okay, so that's just a little bit about wave 3, but what we really want to come to is to ask another question. Is there something beyond wave 3, sustainable infrastructure? Penny, talk us through the question of wave 4, potential wave 4.
Indeed, whenever I talk about the waves, about the 3 waves, somebody will always say, is there a wave 4? And I haven't really wanted to talk about this before because really we don't have very much skill and expertise in wave 4 at the present moment. And so I have kind of resisted talking about it, and that was wrong. And I realised that I really do need to talk about it because if we are going on a journey, it's a good idea to have a map about where we're going. And that is as true for the asset management journey as any physical one. So you'll have noticed that with each of the existing waves, each one builds on the one that went before. So that we need to collect all of our information before we can use the information. So wave 1 has to come before wave 2. And then when we have enough information, we can start really applying ourselves in wave 3 and using that information to assist in making good decisions for sustainable infrastructure for the future. By the time we have become experienced in wave 3, we will start to see things much more clearly than we see them now. That is, by the time we've learned to construct only the infrastructure that is necessary for the future, we will discover 2 things. We will discover one thing, that the world has changed, and many things which were useful once upon a time are not now. One obvious one is what do we do with all our coal-fired power stations that we no longer wish to use? And there's a whole heap of landline telemetry and whole heaps of other things which were useful and they were wisely done at the time, but now are not. But more especially what we will see after we put our effort into wave 3 is that we are now currently building lots of things which are not necessary and which will create a problem for us in the future. Both categories give rise to a problem. Infrastructure which is not needed presents either an economic problem, either we continue to maintain it just to keep it safe, and it becomes an economic problem, or we don't maintain it, and it becomes a social and an environmental problem. We can't avoid the problems, they're just different problems. I think that the environmental and social actually are more important even than in the economic ones, although it's the economic ones that we tend to think of first. So if we do wave 3 well, we will minimize our problem with wave 4. Wave 4, for a long time, we have focused on growth. We have built everything with the idea that we're going to continue growing and growing and growing forever. And I have talked to some people I would have thought quite intelligent people, heads of university departments involved in transport, who think that our population is going to continue to grow and grow and grow and grow forever. Well, not only can it not, it will not. We're already seeing population growth declining. The rates of population growth are now, population is still increasing, but its rate of increase is declining year by year. The UN has projected that in 40 years' time, total global population will actually stop increasing and turn negative. Now, this is not uniform. There are some countries that have got very healthy growth. India and Africa are the two that stand out here. But there are also areas which already have declining population. And here we can look at Japan and Italy. But in fact, most European and most Western countries, including Australia, have declining birth rates. That means that we're only keeping our population up because we allow, in fact, in our case, encourage immigration. It's the same thing for America, although they don't want to admit it. Nevertheless, it is true there too, that they won't be able to keep up their population unless they allow immigration. Australia is in that situation. At the present moment, when I see the UK resisting all of its so-called illegal migrants, I think, you idiots, take them. You really need them and you can benefit from them. It's about time we started thinking about these things differently, because population is not going to increase forever. In fact, I would say that within the next 20 to 30 years, that in Europe and in the West, we are going to start seeing our populations declining. That means we're not going to have enough people to use the infrastructure that we are currently producing, so it can be waste. And we're not going to have enough people to maintain the infrastructure that we can currently buy, so it's going to be damage. Now, we can't wait until this situation is blindingly obvious, or we can start now to carefully consider the nature and scope of future demand and build this into our wave 3 thinking right now. The better we do wave 3, the easier it's going to be to cope with wave 4 when we get there. The wave 4 will be a much smaller problem if we do wave 3 properly. And that really brings me to what I consider are our key takeaways and our call to action now. Our takeaways are that we have faced a major infrastructure renewal problem before. Back in 1984, 85, we could see that we were going to be experiencing a 3- to 4-fold increase in the amount of renewal that we would have to do, but that we had 15 years to plan for it and do it. And we were fortunate to have those 15 years. I like to reference New York, and I feel very sorry for New York. Being the leading country, the leading city in the leading country, he didn't have anybody to follow. We could see what was happening to New York and say, hey, we don't want this to happen to us. And we could use those as an example. So if you are ahead of the game, ahead of the curve, then you have problems which others don't have, because they can follow up and learn from your mistakes. And so we can now look to those countries that already have declining populations and watch what they're doing and see what we can learn from that. But it will require understanding what necessary infrastructure looks like. And this, I think, is going to be our major discussion this year. Certainly it's going to be our major discussion in talking infrastructure. We're going to be looking at understanding what is necessary infrastructure, not the nice things to have, but what we need to have And what it looks like if the population is not going up and up and up and up and up, but in fact is steadying. So how do we move ourselves and the discussion forward on this topic? And that is, I think, the big question that we need to ask ourselves. So as an asset management practitioner, you have a great opportunity to make a real difference here. There's also a great risk if we get it wrong. But I think we have every opportunity to get it right, particularly the sooner we start, the better off we're going to be. So our call to action now, focus on the use value of infrastructure. Instead of building infrastructure to create jobs, because I can tell you as an economist that any government spending at all, they can spend it on ice cream, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they spend it on. Any government spending will boost the economy. It doesn't have to be infrastructure. In fact, it'd be far better for them to spend it on maintenance. So we need to think about infrastructure, not for its temporary, short-term benefits to a certain group of constructors, but really what we need for use by the community on an ongoing basis. That means that we need to avoid overbuilding. We need to be more aware of the costs that are imposed on the future by capital decisions today. Look, we have been thinking of this problem for a long time. I have a PhD student who 30 years ago wrote an entire book on this issue. So the problems are not new, we just haven't tackled them yet. So I think the major issue here is take your courage in your hand. You know a lot, you know a hell of a lot. Use that knowledge and have the courage to share that knowledge with those who are making decisions on new infrastructure. If you are able and willing to advise your boards or decision makers, we have the opportunity to get ourselves out of a real mess. That's my message to you today. Ruth, it's Q&A time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we hope we're not intending to try to answer the question of what we do about steady state infrastructure. It's more that we want to start asking the question. So if you have a question, your question is how do we solve the problem? Watch this space. I don't think we have all the answers. Anyway, yes, Ursula, what do we have?
Thank you very much, both of you, for talking about all the various waves, but also really posing some really key questions for the asset management community. We have had some people putting some questions into the question tab, and if you do have a question, please put them in, because I'm going to just basically go through these questions now and just ask Penny and Ruth the questions, and we'll be really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So the first question comes from John DeBono, and he asks, have you adapted the waves to a manufacturing environment where sales and marketing rule above asset management?
I should say I started with infrastructure because infrastructure was difficult and nobody was looking at it. But most of the issues which we thought up thinking about infrastructure also apply to manufacturing. Actually, manufacturing has an easier job. It really does. It has a bottom line for one thing. The series does tend to make it easier. And you can stop and start manufacturing. Very difficult to stop and start infrastructure. Once you have laid down a piece of infrastructure, a road, a sewer network, a water network, these things are path dependent. They stay there forever, and you have to be committed keeping them there forever. If you put up a car factory, you can take it down. But you can't very well do that with infrastructure. So this is why I focus on the infrastructure issues, because they are more important for everybody and they are more difficult.
Yeah, I wonder whether, John, if your question is about, I think we'd have to kind of have more time. We're obviously happy to talk more offline about wave 3 and wave 4, and obviously the issue, but of things like the circular economy and products, etc. But if you're asking about wave 1 and 2, it may be that wave 1 was more difficult for infrastructure because people had been putting down infrastructure for a long time without keeping records. So we spent a lot of time asking what we actually had. Now, I've worked with enough manufacturers as well to know that they don't always know what they have, but you can see that buried water networks or whatever. But the question I'm sure is true of manufacturing as infrastructure, which is we still spend a lot of time on what should be fairly basic information about our assets, as if that was a goal in its own right. Whereas, of course, the only point of having information is to make better decisions. So I think that issue about wave 1, we really have to look at it through the lens of wave 2. What are the decisions we're making? I think that's equally true for manufacturing, in my experience. And I've certainly worked with all kinds of manufacturers as well. So it's a complicated question and a complicated answer, but I see no reason why, I see no evidence that manufacturing's taken a different path. Sometimes it's thought it's known more than it does, but sometimes it doesn't, but just it's compounded with infrastructure. Sorry.
Thank you both. We've now got a question from Jose Pedro Pedego da Silva Neto. And it's a long question, so I'm going to read it, but if you've got it in front of you, it might help to look at it as well. So, interesting theme. Would like to hear your thoughts on how the upkeep of existing infrastructure can be achieved when the infrastructure projects are implemented by private entities that typically have a finite timeline in mind and are eager to quickly extract value from the project while they can. And then it goes on to say, is the solution public policy imposing adequate upkeep of the built environment to the private parties involved, or are there other alternatives that have been tried? So this is really trying to get at this point that there's a lot of infrastructure being built by private entities who have got a very, very, clear sort of business case and want to get in and extract their value. That's the question he's asking.
It's an excellent question, and it's an excellently difficult problem to answer. The problem that I see is that we have been using the wrong kind of economics to look at this issue of infrastructure. If we look at it in the same way as we look at manufactured goods, in other words, if we look at it as goods for individuals rather than goods for communities, then we use a form of economics which I call exchange economics. In other words, if I buy something from you, you have the money, I have the good, and we've exchanged. But that doesn't apply to infrastructure. So if we use that kind of economics to make our decisions with respect to what is an efficient and effective economic decision on infrastructure, we get the wrong answers. And we've been getting the wrong answers for as long as we've been outsourcing to the private sector, quite frankly. It's a very interesting book by Deborah Chakra called How Infrastructure Works. And she is right on top of this issue that if we really want to create infrastructure, which are shared resources for community use, we can't do it by thinking about what is efficient and effective in the sense of this exchange commodity, because we don't have an exchange. So yes, the answer to your long question is an even longer answer. I am working on it, and that will probably be most of my work this year. So please join us on Talking Infrastructure, because we'll be putting up issues and ideas as we come across them, and we would love you to kind of join in and tell us what you think, if we're going in the right direction or what else we need to think about. Thank you. That was a really good question.
I mean, obviously there's a question about whether we outsource to private profit-making companies' infrastructure. And we're not having great history, are we, in the UK or in England with water? It looks like this was an experiment that failed. However, I think there's a broader question of, you know, how do you pronounce it, cui bono? Who benefits by building constructing infrastructure assets? And too often the answer is construction companies. I mean, we need construction companies, but they benefit just by building them. They don't really care what happens to them afterwards. So, and we've got a lot of sort of perverse incentives about, you know, building new stuff, that the construction, I mean, there's lots of funny stories Penny could tell about trying to talk to the construction industry even 40 years ago about, what are you doing? So I think it's a good question, and as asset managers we can't avoid asking. Whatever you think about private or public ownership of infrastructure, the incentives look horribly wrong, where you get many more benefits if you're building a shiny new asset. You then aren't going to have to look after, and you don't really care what happens next. And we're not even talking about things like developers, who obviously have a very vested interest in something very specific that may not be of actual benefit to the rest of the community. This is a big question, isn't it, Ursula and Jose? But I don't think as asset managers we can avoid it, even if you feel it sounds too political or too economic. Infrastructure is just too important as a shared good for us not to have shared solutions, basically. Anyway, we could go on, as you could tell.
It's interesting. When I started doing asset management, and I was an economist working with engineers, and I thought, and they thought that asset management was some kind of combination of economics and engineering. I think what we're looking at now in terms of infrastructure decision making is that it is a combination not of economics but of political economy and engineering, and not only engineers. As we move into a wider consideration of what is necessary infrastructure, we are bringing in more and more other practitioners. I now deal with philosophers, lawyers. We expect to be dealing with finance people, but you probably don't necessarily think of lawyers and philosophers as being the people that you want to get involved with, but they are really very insightful in this problem of how we deal with good infrastructure decisions.
It's almost like on a bad day, I think it's the conventional economists and conventional engineers who've got us into the mess we're in. And therefore we shouldn't assume that the conventional of either of them will get us out of it. But yeah. All right, we better move on to, but honestly, we've lots.
Thank you both for that. And there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there to unpack. So the next thing isn't actually a question. It's maybe more of a comment, and it's related to when Penny was talking about population. So Miriam McLennan, later she's going to ask some questions, so I'll get to her questions in a minute because I'm dealing with them in the order that they were given. But she's made a comment. She said, imagine if parents were adequately rewarded for free care given to raising the future pension providers. I think that's more of a comment than a question. But we will get to some questions from Miriam because she's got some coming forward. But the next person who asked a question is Craig Walker. And he's asked, as asset management practitioners, how do we educate our organisations and society at large to embrace asset management principles to change how they view the role of infrastructure and how decisions are made regarding infrastructure assets? And this is, I mean, this is a real nugget of things, isn't it?
Indeed. I'd like to tell you a short story, very short. Back about, will be almost 40 years ago now, I was asked to speak to the Minister of Construction's Industry Advisory Group. And I was younger and I would do all sorts of things. And I decided I would tee these people up a bit, because all the people in the audience were the top architects, the top quantity surveyors, the top in all the fields. So I got up and I said, look, any young architect, fresh out of architecture school, can build on a greenfield site. That's not terribly difficult. So why do we pay the top money for that when we should be paying the top money to somebody who can get in, renew a hospital, keep the dust down, keep the dirt down, keep the hospital operating? After I finished, and everybody was all kind of cheated up, the ones who were getting top money weren't at all happy. But the one who was most happy was the minister. He came up to me afterwards and he was literally so excited, he was bouncing on the balls of his feet as he stood in front talking to me. And he said, you must tell everybody what you've just told us. He wanted to move on asset management. He just felt that if he wasn't supported by the electorate, he wouldn't stay there long enough to be able to do anything. And I think that's an important message. We need to make it safe for our decision makers to make the right decision. I knew he was interested because for the next 2 years, whenever I walked into a room where the minister was, no matter what topic he was talking about at the time, as soon as he saw me, he would change the subject to asset management. He was interested, but he just didn't know how to move forward. So I had not yet solved that problem. I had come up with all sorts of ideas, like a little cartoon, regular cartoon in the newspaper. And Ruth and I have played with lots of little funny stories and cartoons and comics. And
yeah, can I say that? Yeah, sorry, Jenny, go on.
Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
I was going to say, I think we obviously have been playing's not the right word, but trying to think about how to interact with policymakers, etc., which of course Penny did right from the beginning of her asset management career. But I think one issue is that the asset management community just must take the problem more seriously. And I don't mean as individuals we don't understand it. So this is perhaps the slightly I don't know the answer. Somebody like Lou Cripps or Jeff Ruder on Talking Infrastructure is actually interacting with governments on and winning some battles and not winning all of them. And I know something like even like the we've got some problems in the UK where there are plenty of people who know there are hard questions to ask about new investments, but we haven't won the argument. There are still plenty of people who have a lot of interest, and maybe including the electorate, thinking, I'd rather think of a shiny new thing. Now, you're right that the issue is maintaining boring old things. You're right that the question is about education, and I would say the Deb Chakra book is that just been published, is a good step forward to actually talk about what infrastructure is, why it matters, and why it matters we get the right answers. But honestly, I think it's just got to be centre focus for lots of us as asset managers to get together and work it out with some practical things. Now, I'm sorry, I don't actually have an answer, but it's absolutely the right question. And we have to think I have to say, I get very irritated that we spend a lot of time talking about things which don't seem to be answering. I mean, I won't go on about AI or whatever it might be, but what are we actually trying to do as asset managers might be the real question. Yeah.
And that really comes back to that question of looking at what we understand by necessary infrastructure. At the present moment, asset managers are spending a lot of their time on technical issues, and though most of those technical issues have been solved, it drives me nuts to think that we are going over and over and over the same area again, instead of saying, what outcomes do we want? If we can now start, as asset managers, start to focus on the outcomes, stop wasting so much time on the technical issues, which I say have solutions, and we can pick up the solutions easily enough in any of the manuals and guidelines and training courses that are around. They're available. Instead, let us put out our attention, our intelligence, looking at the outcomes.
I think it's, I mean, okay, we need to move on to other questions. I'm sorry, this is such a good one. I think some of us are now talking, not just in talking infrastructure, but kind of wider networking, about thinking of asset management as something equivalent to a paradigm shift or a system change. We've got to stop with some of our assumptions and change, do a flip to a different way of looking at infrastructure, or in fact assets generally, not just infrastructure. And I think it's kind of been helpful to me to think this is definitely a hard problem. It is not a simple problem to switch from a growth, build, shiny new thing mentality to something different. Thankfully, there are lots of people who agree, not all of them in infrastructure, not all of them in asset management, but don't get us going on, are we all as asset managers focusing on the really important questions? Because we could obviously wish on about that forever, but I feel we should give people stick around with us, because we're really trying to have that dialogue. Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm just looking through
good questions. What can we do?
Just checking the time. I might just not ask every question, because we've got more questions than we can. But we'll just pick up some of these questions. I think the next one, Miriam McLennan's asked a question, which is, how do you see circular economy playing out on a global scale between the redundant assets in the overdeveloped world and the lack of assets in an underdeveloped world? I mean, this is a cracking question, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We were talking about the some talking infrastructure. We're talking this weekend about how obviously China is going to find it doesn't need any new infrastructure, but it's now exporting its skills. Or it has been done for a while to somewhere like Africa. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because the trouble with infrastructure is that you can't actually literally pick it up from one place and go and move it to some other place most of the time. I have to say, I take very seriously the problem of lack of infrastructure in certain places, because it's impossible to have a kind of healthy, fulfilled life with inadequate infrastructure. It's almost definition of civilization. But the question we have to deal with right here and now in our own cultures is also that of what to do with, as you said, with redundant assets. What are we going to do with them? And I think there's a little bit of me that says we're already seeing that problem with stranded and orphan assets, etc., and over capacity. But for heaven's sake, let's not make it worse by building more. I don't know what we do about. We can export skills and support to places with inadequate infrastructure, but it really panics me that we're still wanting to build new infrastructure as if it's, I mean, something like the Biden Act. I know it's not really called that, but it recognizes the problem that we've funded shiny new assets and not maintenance, and said that it will look at funding renewals and replacements and ongoing maintenance. But it's very half-hearted still, because the lobbies for building shiny new things are really, really huge. So I think that's another really great question. And I would actually say perhaps in the IEM, perhaps we should take more seriously the question of what can we do with Western asset managers? What, if anything, have we got to offer about sustainable infrastructure in somewhere like Africa? There's no point in building stuff that's going to be redundant in Africa. We can replicate Western problems. So I think there's a lot of good questions to keep us going in IEM webinars for a very long time. But I also think we have to do lots more than that. We have to be actively networking and raising, I think Penny said at some point, kind of raising our game about what we think we're here for, really, as asset managers.
I'm gonna just nip down this list of questions, because I am going to call a halt to things at the top of the hour. So, and I'm just conscious we've got quite a few questions left. David Harmon asked a question about resolving wave 3 and wave 4 will require resolving the influence of regulatory and political short-termism. Also, politicians and executives are personally driven by re-election concerns, bonus payouts, etc. Should we as asset management practitioners be promoting performance-related pensions, i.e. long-term performance? This is a cracking question.
Gosh, I have to say the quality of fantastic.
I'd be interested to hear your reaction to this, Ruth. My reaction is I don't think we should be buying into purely political issues, because we can go down a rabbit hole so very quickly in that. But yeah, there are many problems that need to be solved as we move into wave 3 and 4. But if we know what wave 3 and 4 is about, we can then steer a path between those things which are going to get us somewhere and those things which are going to send us off on a tangent. Bruce, what do you reckon?
Yes, I don't. I mean, you know, all of these are such persistent problems. As part of the problem is that we haven't worked out a way to do incentives for executives to think longer term. We've failed to crack the question of how to incentivize CEOs to think longer term. So we can see why it's a big problem if we're trying to now think of it as being the population as a whole about incentivizing long-term thinking. I mean, obviously, you'll know, David, that there's lots of work going on about how to get people to think more long-term. There was a lovely article last week saying, scary article saying, we've got a huge industry using kind of behavioral techniques to encourage us all to consume short-term and one-off use stuff. So whatever we're talking about, and you know, there's a huge machine out there still pumping out ways to make us buy more short-term things. But at least people are starting to say, well, what could we do with these behavioral techniques to change it? And but it's a great, I feel completely inadequate at this point. Another really great question. And I suppose the last word then here has to be, we're smart people, but as long as we understand that we have a very important role to play, we must step up to the plate and use our smarts and our experience and our understanding of assets, physical assets. We have to realize where that fits in a bigger, larger shift of society, I guess. It doesn't help if we are doing our own little thing, you know. Lou Cripps called it, we've got to move from sort of in and down to up and out as a perspective in asset management, and see that. Nobody else is going to do it, actually, when it comes to physical assets.
So I'm conscious of time. We have run out of time. We have got more questions. So what we'll do is we'll make sure we extract the questions and we'll send them through to Ruth and Penny, because there's some really cracking questions which we just didn't get round to. I'm really sorry, but we did have a really good thrash in terms of time with the questions. So so I wanted to say a massive thank you to Penny and Ruth, who've both joined us at awkward times of day for wherever they are. So we tried to get something in the middle. So unfortunately, you were both inconvenienced. I apologise about that. But massive thank you for joining us. And we have recorded the webinar, so we will be keeping it, and we'll get the recording out so people can see it. And I think there's lots of topics here to continue the dialogue. So thank you very much, Penny and Ruth.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, Ursula. I appreciate it.
And keep talking to us. You'll find us talking infrastructure, doing lots of stuff on talking infrastructure. So join us, basically.
And thank you everyone for joining and for all your questions. And you can see the either LinkedIn or the emails. We've got some more webinars coming up in 2024. So looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you, everyone.
Right. Thank you. Bye-bye.